Before we could go and explore the tunnel that we had been forcibly removed from, we had to talk with the other villages and the other village chiefs to find out what they had found during their excursions, and the results were interesting. As it turns out that there were many of these tunnels scattered around, some only about the size of a person, others so big you could swear a semi-truck wouldn't have any problems coming through. However, they were all separated almost evenly around us. We couldn't figure out why, and we didn't realize this till we plotted it down on our maps. And it was pretty obvious that for some reason there were tunnels, not only the ones under our feet, but the ones through the mountainsides. Thankfully, we had also found other trails that could get us out of this valley. Though it was a large valley and we could produce enough food to survive here, survival is not always thriving. So we had to find out what in the hell was going on so that we could keep our people safe. This would take about a week's worth of deliberation and another week to gather everyone up along with the resources themselves to make sure that we could take one of these tunnels. The tunnel that we decided on was not the one that we had previously gone down, as it was covered in those whatever creepy crawlies those were. Damn things were about as big as my torso, and I'd rather not play with those again. Another one was housing some of those spiders. It was one of the much, much larger tunnels. However, the largest one found, we really didn't want to go near, as the signs of trolls were everywhere. Footprints and very large piles of scat littered the ground. It looked as though they went on a certain pattern as they went out and went on a weird patrol. Surprisingly, they didn't bother us so much. However, we did realize that it was a bad idea to screw with them. However, that was not what truly put the brakes on everything. It was the fact that Village 4, one that was not us, we were Village 2, but Village 4 was being attacked by goblins. A lot of them. And it turned out that goblins in a horde are very difficult to stop. So they lit their signal fire and we hurried as fast as we could to get to them. Thankfully, they were able to hold on to their walls and were not fully breached. However, the goblins were not exactly stupid. They had started bringing a battering ram to try and break through the doors. However, their small bodies limited the amount of pressure they could put behind it. It was clear they had not domesticated any animals either, as they only had what they could do pushing this battering ram through. The battering ram itself was a very, very simplistic design, only wheels underneath and a giant log sharpened to a point to try and break through the doors. We rushed in, and it wasn't hard to dispatch the goblins themselves. It was just that there were so many of them. And when they grabbed you, they started clawing at you. But it was strange, as they didn't actually claw at you seemingly to hurt you or to kill you. They clawed at your clothing to rip it off. This creeped us the hell out, but thankfully a few of us had firearms and we could pick off a few of them as they tried to make their way towards us. This would scatter the majority of goblins, but then they would swing around and start attacking from all angles. Unfortunately for them, we had already started to fashion ourselves not only armor, but shields, swords, spears, and anything else. One of the villages was able to create crossbows, and thankfully this is what had turned out to hold the goblin horde back. And as the goblin horde retreated, it was decided that we would not fall prey to them again, and we followed the horde. We tracked them the whole way, which wasn't difficult, as they were not trying to hide any of the tracks that they were going through the bush with. In fact, a blind man could have followed them, and I'm saying that quite literally, as they broke every branch, left all sorts of trails, and left piles of shit everywhere as they ran. Didn't even seem like they stopped, as they would just leave it as a long trail. As we found them inside a different cave, not a tunnel, but an actual cave inside the mountain, we pondered what we could do. We didn't have enough explosions to bring the cave down, except for our one rocket, which was being held off specifically for trolls, knowing that it was a device that could work on them, and work very well. And as we watched, we realized They weren't as dumb as we thought. Their sentries had noticed us, and they came out in a large pack again. We fought them as best we could, but we had to start pulling back. I remember Bill screaming as another one of these things grabbed his tail and tried to pull him down. I swear I'm glad I don't have a tail, because that looks like it hurts. He just simply whipped it around and started bashing him, using the goblin that was holding on as a club, which was kind of funny, but at the time I didn't have time to laugh. Goblins were still coming at us, and we tightened our perimeter as close as we could, back to back with each other, as we made our way out. Every goblin that came in would be either sliced, pierced, or eviscerated in some way, shape, or form. The goblins themselves were fairly weak, as if they jumped up and smacked into our shields, we could hear bones crack. Thankfully, this gave us the opening we needed, and on a signal, we all bolted as fast as we could. Goblins may be nasty in a group, but they're small, and they're not fast. When we got back to the village, we found out who was casualties and who wasn't, and we started to put two and two together and realized that we had to take care of the goblin horde. However, it wasn't until later on, as we were talking, we couldn't figure out why the goblins had reproduced so fast. And then we looked at the map, and I could have kicked myself at that moment. The trolls. The trolls were eating the damn goblins. If we looked at the main trail went down and past that cave, but apparently it didn't get close enough that the trolls realized the goblins were there. Then again, leaving such a large trail of goblin bodies, maybe if the trolls showed up, they'd be able to fight them. Then again, we didn't know, and we couldn't trust the trolls to do what we wanted to either. If they couldn't get enough to eat via those giant bugs or the goblins, they came after us, though we fought back a whole lot better. So, the council convened, and we decided what to do. As we couldn't see any reason to keep them around, as they did not really increase any productivity in the biome. In fact, they stole many of our crops, and were only just food for the trolls, and if the trolls starved off, it wouldn't be no hair off our ass. As if any of us had any body hair anymore. It was decided that we would exterminate them. This would be achieved by finding the extra parts of the tunnel, as we realized that they must have other entrances, or else they wouldn't be able to get around to behind us the way they were. And then block them off, and then burn them out. A simple idea. We had enough combustible materials, enough, pig fat, rendered pig fat, that we could just set that on fire and make a type of Molotov cocktail, just throw down the cave. Of course, we'd want to get in the cave as far as possible before that. The cave itself was a solid hunk of rock, so trying to collapse it wasn't going to be an ideal situation. This would take some time. As we got everything ready, several groups would go out and search for the other caves, and we found that there was a dozen more. This made things a little bit more difficult, as we would have to disassemble our forces and break them apart, separate them to each portion, so that when the goblins ran, we'd have someone there to stop them. Even if one left, we didn't know if only one could survive and reproduce asexually or what. We didn't know, we didn't really care. We just knew we had to stop them. It was decided on where we would be and what day, and we left that morning. It was approximately 2 weeks after our discovery of the tunnel with the blast door that we ended up at the front of the Goblin's tunnel. Each of us would be ready. As we went inside, a total of half a dozen went in. I took point, as I had just a few rounds of ammunition left, and I had enough light in the one flashlight we had functioning to lead the way. Going down the tunnel was beyond eerie. Nothing moved. The sound of running water in the distance, but that was about it. And down into the tunnel we went. Further down, trying not to slip on the amount of goblin shit that was on the ground. We could smell them all over. And then we started to see something off in the distance. I clicked off my flashlight and I motioned for everybody to get close. Everybody reached out one hand on each other and one hand on their weapons as we went closer and closer to the light we saw. As we went in, we saw a large room. Inside that large room was something that still gives me nightmares to this day. There was goblin females. We didn't realize that they were actually goblin females. We only understood the goblin males. But what we didn't know was what we saw there. Inside the large room that smelled so bad and was so full of ammonia and all other chemicals that it burned our eyes as we looked around the corner. Dozens of goblin females were on the ground, many of them cradling children. Others were being held down and forcibly assaulted by the goblin males. Those that had children, the goblin males were fighting at them, lashing at them even, trying to pull the young ones away. One or two of the males would jump on the females, pull the child away, and what the male did with the child, I don't even want to say it. After that, when they were done, if the child even survived, they would simply go to the female and start forcing themselves on her. It wasn't until we got a much closer look as one of the young ones that was assaulted to death was thrown our way. We saw it as it came out of the little bit of clothing that it had. The slight cloth opened up, and we saw that it was a female. We started looking even closer, and we realized that all the goblins, the young ones, were female. We didn't understand this. We kept looking and started whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was going on. And then we heard something large moving around. It was a very, very large goblin, almost tantamount to some sort of cave troll. Thing must have stood 8 feet tall and was clearly female. Was clearly pregnant. Yet it seemed to just squat down and almost shit out another goblin. Looking close, we could see that this goblin was male. This didn't make sense. Something was screwed up in their genetics. Something was just off. We couldn't figure out what it was. But the plan was put on hold until we talked to the rest. We rushed out of the cave as fast as we could, and it was immediately decided that we would do what we can to save the females and find out what in the hell was going on. And we suddenly realized why the other goblin males were tearing at us the way they were. They weren't trying to kill us. They were trying to breed. Ugh. The thought was enough to send chills down all of our spines, especially those of us who had actually been grabbed and groped and ripped at by these things. Bill himself wrapped his tail up around his leg and just held himself and shivered. I could understand he was a little off, as he would the first one that they almost took. With a slight alteration to the plan, we went down the tunnel with even more personnel, the best fighters we had to offer. We went down with smaller weapons. My firearm wouldn't do much help, especially since I only had about 7 rounds left. However, one target was in mind. The big one. I had to make sure that thing did not get loose. As we got to the edge of the lit area, the torches themselves seemed to be being restocked by other goblins. And as we made our way down the tunnel, one of them jumped out and immediately got a knife to the eyeball for this trouble. It only flinched for a moment and then went limp. Tossing it to the side, we moved down and saw that these things, they were still at it. Even if the small females were heavily pregnant, they were still being assaulted, some of them trying to huddle themselves into a corner for protection, and yet you could still hear that god-awful laugh of theirs. It was enough to drive anyone to sheer and utter rage. With that, we signaled back to the group, and we got the countdown, 3, 2, 1, and we went in, raging all sorts of hell. The goblins were thankfully taken by surprise. They may be great ambush predators, but they do not like it when you come at them, especially since we just towered over them, doubling their size at least, coming at them with blades and bows as best we could. We started slashing at all the males as much as we could, slicing their heads clean off, picking them up, tossing them into a wall, hearing the sickening crunch as their skulls crushed against it. I remember distinctly butt-stroking one in the face, and as it writhed in pain, I brought my foot down, smashing its skull against the granite underneath. We went at them with sheer, unadulterated rage, and as some of the goblins tried to run down the tunnels, the others from the other group came down, and they were suddenly facing not just some blue-skinned, skinny creature like me. No. They were facing the wrath of things like ogres and other demons like that, and they were more than a little pissed off. They went for every single one of these goblins, and we just started screaming, kill them all! And every single person went down that tunnel, started going into a blood-filled rage as they would pick up goblins, tear them clean in half, smash them against the walls, almost juggling them as they began to punch and swing and kick as each of the goblins grabbed any type of weapon implement and came at us. Some just came at us with their strange claw-like hand and began to slash. I took one right across the leg, then I turned and backhanded the goblin into someone else. The red-haired demon one, not Bill, but his friend, picked up that goblin by the back of the head, and as he did, he stuck his clawed hands in between the goblin's eyes. The goblin thrashed in pain, and he actually twisted his hands hard, and the goblin's skull cracked in his hand, and then he just dropped it like the sack of shit it was. The battle itself only lasted a few minutes, but then we heard it. The big one was coming, and the big one was not alone. As it turned out, there was some sort of subclass of goblins that was there. The ones that were protecting her were about 6 feet tall, maybe a little less. Very broad, but they were still clearly goblins and not trolls. However, they were much bigger, not very fit, and seemingly emaciated. They still came at us, many of them running on all fours as they ran at us, screaming as the female just raised her hand and roared at us. I looked up and I realized this was my chance. I raised my rifle, flipped off the safety, got a bead on her, and just began to fire one round after another right into that bitch's head. She flinched her head back as I still remember putting round after round into her eyes, into her forehead, into her neck, until ka-chunk, I'm out. That was when one of the larger ones came up and swatted me off to the side. I could have swore I had a concussion that moment, but I slid off to the side and got myself back on my feet just to look over as Bill, in his unadulterated rage, had actually stuck his tail into this thing's neck and pulled it back out, climbing off its back as the goblin fell to its knees, bleeding out, and then splatted on the ground. We looked at the carnage around us, and many were almost elated at the idea that they had come in and just killed as many as possible. Then we looked in the corners. The goblin females were scared, some of them still clutching their young, just shaking in fear at the sheer carnage and melee that had just happened around them. I didn't have to say anything, as we all knew that we needed to protect the young. That's something that is still in us. We're still human enough for that. I sling my weapon across my back, and I began to collect any type of metal that they had, as we could repurpose it later. A few of the women went over to help out the goblin females, which seemed to calm them a little bit. We offered them what little food we had so that they would relax a little bit, and we led them out of the cave. They didn't care much for sunlight, as their eyes had adapted to be inside that cave with limited light sources, such as torches. However, it didn't take long that they were no longer covering their eyes. One of the small goblins actually came and grabbed onto my leg, and seemed to be in fear as the little one gripped onto my calf. I looked down as it looked up to me, and I could clearly see that it was scared, but it looked to me for protection. I couldn't reach down and tap it on the head as I wanted to, as my hand was on my leg trying to stop the bleeding. I was worried that I might have a bacterial infection, so we did what we could as soon as we got back to the closest village. The goblin females were given a small area, and unfortunately, they really couldn't talk. Their language was a strange sort of grunting that we couldn't understand, but apparently each of them could. However, within just a few days, they began to try and speak in standard English, which was a nice change of pace. When they finally started to understand, we offered them an area where they could build for themselves. We would help them build the wall and rebuild the main house, but after that it was theirs. It was Village 7, the one that had been taken down by the trolls. They happily agreed to this once they fully understood what we were talking about. A home of their own. However, we began to wonder if this might be a mistake. Do we still want goblins to be around? But we're not around here trying to slaughter women and children. But are we inhuman enough to take them out if they have to? We didn't worry about that. As for the next few weeks, we rebuilt the walls, rebuilt the tower, and the main facility. We showed them how to build, how to construct, and how to gather resources. It wasn't long until they had their own village. We told them that they would have to protect. We showed them how to light the fire if they needed us if the trolls ever attacked. However, this was their village now. And we kept them in village number 7 for one reason and one reason only. It was the farthest one away. So if for some reason we had to come back, or if they decided to start raiding other villages, they would have a long way to go. It wouldn't be worth them to burn all that energy to try and raid one of the other villages. However, we would still be interested to see what type of commerce would come from them. But once they were settled, we had another issue. We had to get back to figuring out which tunnel we were going to open. Now that we didn't have a cave to clear, we had to focus on which one, and it was decided that there was the largest one that we would go into. Not the one that I had found earlier, but a separate one. This separate one would be able to hold all of us, all of those who wanted to be there when the doors were opened. And then we could simply pass the knowledge to everyone. We would also have strength in numbers, which was important. Reaching the tunnel, we realized that it had an extremely similar setup to what we had seen before. So it was easy to find the manual override. And of course, we got to it. Starting to crank away, we realized it was actually 2 cranks. One right next to the other, well, about 2 feet away, of course. But this allowed each of us to work. As one crank would go down, the other one would go up, and back and forth we went. This moved the blast doors much faster than before, and it wasn't long until we could see what was on the other side. And what was on the other side surprised us. Before we even had a chance to even understand what was going on, somebody started screaming. They were on the ground flinching as I turned to look at them. Next thing I know, nets were flying out from the other side of the wall. What the hell was going on? Suddenly I was hit by something and I was being shocked. Down to a knee I went as I screamed in pain. What the hell? I looked down and there's prongs sticking out of me. Looking forward, I realized that somebody is holding a taser. Reaching up, I grabbed the prongs and ripped them out, which hurt like hell, but not as bad as the actual shocking. I reached over, grabbed a couple of the wires, and yanked them as hard as I could, ripping at least one of the prongs out, which means the current was no longer going through the wires. Our people began to get up, and we saw what was coming at us. Men in all sorts of tactical gear were beginning to take the area. They surrounded us with weapons drawn, and we just had to stop and wait. They had us outnumbered, outflanked, and severely outgunned. Only one crossbow was able to be fired in time, which did catch one of these men dressed in black. However, it was not a mortal wound. He seemed to be more pissed off that he was actually hit. They were speaking standard English. So I started asking questions. So the rest of them, what the hell's going on? Why are you doing this? Tell us what's going on. Before we knew what was going on, all of us were bagged and tagged, put on Prusik cuffs, and dragged beyond the blast door. It didn't matter, man, woman, old, young, they were all taken. And inside we went. Not too long later, I was sitting in a chair as somebody pulled the bag from over my head. I was in some sort of interrogation room. The walls were straight out of a movie, with obviously the big one-way mirror. I looked around, and the one who had pulled the bag off my head was a security guard, and across the table from me was someone in a suit. A fucking suit? How is this possible? We've been living off the land for how long now? This guy's in a suit? We're in some sort of modern facility? Somebody want to tell me what the hell is going on? It wasn't long until the man spoke. He began to ask me all sorts of questions, which I honestly did not want to answer. I still remember one of our number, who was being bagged at the time, started screaming, "Don't say anything, don't say anything." I'm pretty sure I heard a crunch as he was hit. Probably knocked out. However, I started asking this person in a suit, "What do you want with us, and where the hell am I?" and a course of other questions along with a bunch of expletives. The security guard came up and butt-stroked me on the side of the head. It hurt, but I expected it to hurt a whole lot worse than it did. The one in the suit began to ask me the same questions again in a robotic fashion. I looked over and told him, in no uncertain terms, to go to hell. It wasn't too much longer after that they decided to hook me up to some strange electrode-looking things and told me that if I did not cooperate, then I would be punished. Well, what can I say? Shocker, I wasn't impressed. It was not long before I could hear other people screaming down the hall. However, there was suddenly a different type of scream. It was a type of roar. I know that sound. I know it very well. He's a friend of mine. I could then hear crashing as I also began to hear an alarm sound saying, "Security breach, security breach," as all the doors began to lock themselves seemingly. The security guard ran to the door and tried to get it open. He couldn't open it up at first until he swiped a security badge. I looked over as the door swung open and he ran out in the hallway, weapon drawn, and the door shut behind him. The doc just looked at me and, still in a robotic fashion, began to ask questions. I laughed. I seriously laughed. You really think that's going to stop him? You guys are dumber than you look. The doctor was not exactly thrilled at that comment and simply asked, "Why do you think that?" Trying to get information out of me, obviously. So I said, "You're stupid because you think, one, bullets are going to stop him. I've seen that guy tank a ballista shot. It got through his skin, but it wouldn't actually pierce through the bones. His bones are actually more dense than those trolls. What do you know about our trolls? Your trolls?" That's when the doctor realized that he had given up just a little bit of information. He didn't want to give up information. But guess what? I wanted all the info. Just then, the doctor reached up and zapped me a little bit. At least he thought it hurt. I looked at him and laughed. And then he did it again. Guess what, dude? That itches. And it just tickles a little bit. The one in the suit got up and tried to adjust the electrodes, not realizing that I had undone my Prusik cuffs. Just enough that I could get a little bit of movement. I then reached up and snapped one arm free, grabbed him by the neck, slammed his head down on the table. With the other hand, I pulled the electrodes free and then got some leverage and snapped the other Prusik cuff. Something was wrong. I shouldn't be able to snap these things. I've seen these things before. Most men can't get out of these. Whatever, I didn't have time to think about it. I reached up and started looking through the man's jacket and actually found what I was looking for. a security badge. The man began to come back to, and then I grabbed his head up and then smashed it again on the metal table. There was an audible crunch, and I didn't know if I killed him or not, but his body slumped to the ground. I ran over to the door, swiped the security badge. The door immediately opened, and I looked out the hallway left and right. I could see the back of a security guard as he looked down the hallway, yelling to a few other people. I ran down as fast as I could, jumped on him, and threw him into the wall. And then I could hear him thrashing around, but it was strange. I could hear bones cracking underneath every time I grabbed him. That doesn't sound right. I went back to my old martial arts training, grabbed his arm and cranked it out, and with unexpected ease, his shoulder came right out of joint. This made him drop his weapon, so I grabbed his weapon, shoved it in his mouth, and blew the back of his head off. Unfortunately, that's when I looked up and realized a few more security personnel were coming my way. All I had time for was to say, "Oh shit." That is when Bill and his other demon-looking buddy came into play. They jumped on the security guards like a pair of amphetamine-soaked circus monkeys and started tearing at them. Bill's clawed hands made short work of the guard, and we immediately grabbed their weapons and ammo and started moving. We went from door to door, trying to find our people and finding one in every single one of the rooms. However, one of the rooms made us immediately pause. How did they get our young ones? Didn't we leave them behind in our village? What are they doing here? We immediately got them and tried to go as fast as we could, and that's when we realized that our young human that we had saved wasn't moving. "Honey, why aren't you coming with us?" As it turned out, she was going a bit catatonic. We actually had to pick her up and carry her out of there. Thankfully, once we put her on our centaur friend's back, she was okay. She just grabbed on around the centaur's waist and took off. They were behind us as we made our way down. More and more of our people were breaking out of the cells themselves, and then as we worked our way down this new facility, we tried to figure out where the hell we were. We followed as many signs as we could down to whatever security station there was. The security agent looked at us with just absolute shock as a bunch of creatures just came through the door and looked at him. I didn't have time to raise my rifle, as somebody else had already put a bullet through his chest, right through the glass. We went to the security station and started opening everything up. We could hear down the hallway some of our own fighting their way out of their own holdings. However, we still had to go free a few of them. We may be strong enough to break the cuffs, but some of them just aren't, especially not the kids. We tried to get as many as possible. However, what it turned out is a lot of these folks began to grab the few men and women who were dressed up very nicely, too nicely for some sort of post-apocalyptic shit. As we began to move, we started drilling them with questions. When they wouldn't answer, one of our cohorts would incentivize them, as the fact that some of us had claws, others had fangs, and you really didn't want a lizardman to bite you. They tended to have a lot of bacteria in the mouth. That was enough to get them to start talking, and what they started saying as we kept looking for our people shocked us to the core. As it turned out, the super rich had decided they wanted to have fun with genetic mutation, something that is common for the super rich throughout history. They always want to play God, and it never seems to work out quite as well as they would hope, not once people realize they've been played. We found out that we were one of a half a dozen different areas where the genetic engineering had been manipulated deliberately. There was no war, there was no EMP, there was no anything else. Things were left behind specifically for us to find. And it suddenly hit me, how in the hell would I have found a newspaper? That's what didn't make sense. It wasn't even yellow like it should be after that long. It wasn't really degraded. It was easy to read. Suddenly I realized that we had been played, and more than a few of our number were beyond pissed off. They looked at themselves and then looked at the doctors or scientists or whatever the hell they were and started asking, "Why did you do this to us? What the hell do we do to you?" They started explaining that the super rich had wanted their own fantasy worlds to work in. However, they didn't have the ability to make automatons from scratch. It was a whole lot easier and cost effective just to alter people. People were judged on their psychological reading to find out what would be best suited for them. However, this was not always the case. One of the items that got changed that people just didn't understand is that when you adjust one side, there's an equal and opposite reaction to the other. We found out this is why we were able to break out of our restraints so easily, is the fact that even though they made our bodies thinner and more dainty, it was pretty clear that we had enhanced strength in compared to a normal human. So, in that case, I grabbed one of them and I wanted to test that theory. I grabbed the man by his collar and I was able to lift him up one-handed. This man must have weighed 220 pounds if he weighed an ounce, and yet I'm raising him one-handed without much problem. It never occurred to me that we had been moving larger pieces of equipment, larger pieces of wood, and doing a lot of manual labor that should have put us in almost a coma with overexertion. But here we were, now more than human. Tossing him off to the side, Bill actually grabbed a hold of him, flashed his claws, and said, "Tell me something. Is that why I look like this? I was the man's man, now I look like some chick. What the hell is going on?" Through whimpers, the man and the woman next to him explained that to justify the cost, they would have to make some sort of recreation for the super rich. When we realized this, we looked at each other, finally sat back and looked at each other and realized that was why the genetic abnormalities. Why was it that all the trolls seemed to be male? Why was it that all the goblins were seemingly could only produce females except for the one? Why is it that we all looked slimmer? Why is it we all had a reduced jawline? Why is it I got confused for female a few times, even though, believe me, if I remove my pants, you can tell I'm not a girl. Why is this? Well, the super rich wanted playthings. They wanted to charge people hundreds of thousands just to go in and walk around and interact with us. How they were going to do this? The tunnels. The tunnels were meant to be secret. They didn't expect us to expand all the way out. They expected actually less of us to survive the transformation, and those that did survive were not going to have human forethought. We would be idiots, just smart enough to survive, but not smart enough to be a real threat. Basically, they wanted what the village of female goblins is now. That was their main focus. However, genetic engineering comes with its own X factors, and the X factors turned out to be us. We forced them to answer more questions as we pushed them forward down the hallway to each of the levels so we could get the rest of our people. Not surprisingly, we found other creatures in there. We found a couple of dragons that had been anesthetized. We found a troll that was being dissected. It was all sorts of different things. We even found that they had been monitoring the facilities themselves. They had been watching us. Looking at the cameras, we realized that our facility had a grand total of 2 cameras, and it didn't occur to me that one of them was one of the lamps in the corner that none of us actually got rid of, and the other one was a simple security camera set up in the lobby. These were the only ones that were still functional. And then it occurred to me, that's why they had power to that last one. Somebody felt bad for this young girl that got left behind. We asked about that, and they said at the time when the genetics started to happen, they realized that people were popping out of their pods well before the incubation period was supposed to be done. They couldn't disrupt the experiment, so they ordered everybody to evacuate as fast as they could. They threw up some sort of bullshit story about how the world had gone to shit and how monsters were attacking. However, as people, well, not quite the people, got out of their pods and started rampaging around, this was enough to sell the employees the idea that the world had gone to hell. But they needed to get the employees out as fast as possible before we had become fully conscious. Because if we had, we would have found out what the hell was going on and would never have gone with it. I remember looking to every person as we couldn't figure out why they had insisted on doing this. It was so far beyond screwed up. How in the world were we supposed to survive? I don't know if they could fix it. We asked if they could, and they kind of paused and looked at each other. We knew from that look that whatever changes they had done to us was permanent. In a bid to quell our rage, they begged for us to stop and let them show that we had actually gone beyond that of human, at least physically. Our bodies themselves were now regenerative, far beyond anything the human capability was. Almost all of us were immune to things like cancer. None of us even considered the idea of smoking or drinking again because we were totally clean on that. And yet, that still did not quell the anger as one of our elf friends grabbed a hold of the female. Since they were both girls, she screamed, "You bitch," and clocked the woman so hard that her jaw ripped off her skull. The woman sat there on the ground thrashing as she reached up and realized she couldn't even scream as she was beginning to choke on her own blood. One of the other guys thought he'd be merciful, and he put a bullet through her skull. This motivated the rest of them not to try us at all as we finally got to the central section of this facility. Inside the central section was all sorts of control nodes and things of that nature. However, we looked around to find the central area. We knew that whatever was in the center, whatever controlled it, we had to get our hands on. At that point, we realized that security, since it had been alerted, was finally beginning to show up en masse. However, they underestimated the number of creatures that were now free, as we had released all of them, not just our own people, but those big-ass bugs. Some of those spider folks were free as well. Also, goblins. Lots of goblins, most of which we had to keep away from us. But what made everyone really nervous was that the trolls were now in the large area, the large central section of the facility. 5 different trolls started to thrash around and tear equipment apart. This kept the majority of the security very occupied, and this was our chance. We made our run towards the central section, and we found them. We found the entire staff still in there trying to lock down doors and get any sort of a semblance of order. It was the look on their face that still makes me smile to this day, the look of fear, as all sorts of blue, red, green, and even purple rushed through that door and began to take over the entire area. I grabbed the one who was in the middle, still barking orders to everyone, trying to lock everything down, grabbed him by the throat as I saw him reach for a sidearm. Billy just reached up, grabbed his arm, and twisted it with his claws as he sunk the talons deep into the dude's arm. He screamed in pain, and I pulled him close. "So you're the one in charge?" He started yelling, Yeah, I am, ow, ow, ah. Fine. I looked at the others, I looked at him, and simply just tossed him to the side in the middle of the group. And they began stomping the crap out of him, quite literally at one point, until they ended up crushing his rib cage. We then realized that the young ones were watching. We didn't need them to see this, so we pushed a few outside to make sure they were okay. We went to the rest of the technicians, and we found out the layout of the actual facility. It encompassed this entire mountain range. In fact, the mountain range was somewhat elevated to make room for it, which suddenly made me smile when I realized something. I looked and there was an actual purge. A purge of all the possible creatures that they had locked up. Immediately went to each of the consoles with all the rest and began flipping a bunch of switches so that the entire facility would not only just open up all its doors, but every single one of the creatures, whether it be a sentient species or some sort of abomination, was now free to loom around, free to go out any tunnel it desired. However, we did hope that it went in the opposite direction. And then we found the reactor. Oh boy. A reactor? Really, guys? That was a bad idea. Ripping the technician away, I looked over to our local authority on electronics and asked her, "So, can you do anything with this?" She just looked at me and smiled and said, "Yep, I can bring this whole place to the ground. I looked at her. Do it. And she started flipping switches. I didn't know exactly what she was doing, but I looked over the rest of the group and I said, we got to get out of here. Our group started demanding that the technicians lead them back out to their original valley, and the technicians hesitated for only a moment until they saw the warning signals go up on the screens. The reactor was going to blow, and there was nothing they could do about it since they couldn't get back to their stations. They turned, looked, and led the way. However, they began to run. I heard one of our number scream, "Don't run or we'll shoot you." The technician turned around and said, "We don't run, we don't survive." And they all bolted. I wasn't far behind them as I grabbed my local technician and we both bolted out the door. As the door shut, I beat the hell out of the locking mechanism in an attempt to make sure no one went in and stopped our work. We ran as fast as we could, dodging the occasional projectile as it flew past us. One of our number got clipped in the shoulder. As I grabbed a hold of his tail and tried to pull him off to the side, he screamed, "Ow, that hurts." I said, "What hurts worse, that or the bullet?" He goes, "My tail, asshole." So we picked him up and took him over. Another of our number took a couple rounds to the legs, but being as wide as he was, he barely even missed a stride. It took us less than 3 minutes to actually find the tunnel's entrance. However, it was a long-ass tunnel. The technicians ran up to the vehicles that were stationed there and started yelling for everybody to get on. We climbed on as best we could. A few of us still knew how to drive vehicles, so we grabbed every single vehicle and started clambering onto it, as many as we possibly could. Even a few of the other human technicians that worked there were running for their own safety, and we told them if they wanted to live to get on. They were hesitant at first until we stuck a hand out. They grabbed a hold and we yanked them up top. We held the smaller children down and also the goblins and anything that might get thrown out, and we just hammered the gas. We must have hit 60 miles an hour going down that tunnel, and it seemed like the tunnel wasn't going to end. It must be 4 or 5 miles long, and then we could see daylight. Daylight, the salvation we were looking for. We got to the end, and we could actually feel the rumbling underneath the tires. We finally got to the end, and right out into the area where the trolls had been coming out. We know because my vehicle slid on a massive pile of troll shit and almost lost control. Unfortunately, there were no roads, and the vehicles couldn't get us very far. So as far as we could get, we got out of the vehicles and we began to run. We ran back towards the closest village. We started screaming at them to get inside, get inside. And of course they did. Unfortunately, they didn't want to open up the gates for us. But we looked back as our backs were against the walls of the village. We looked to the mountain as the rumbling truly began to shake everything. Most of us lost our balance, myself included. I landed on my ass and looked over as the ground around the mountain seemed to burst up, rippling out as a shockwave went underneath the entirety of the mountain. A few seconds later, the mountain itself began to slump and fall as though it was dropping one floor at a time and then speeding up faster and faster and faster until the mountain itself began to crumble apart and settle down in a huge mound of rubble. And then everything was quiet. We looked around, still catching our breath, looking at the destruction. Those on the wall of the village started screaming, "What the hell just happened?" We had to explain to them what was going on, and they were not happy at the fact that they had been forcibly changed into what they were. Eventually, we got back to our villages. We told the human technicians they could stay with us if they wanted, but they would have to work. Many of them were desk jockeys, so of course this was going to be difficult for them. However, it was less than a day before we headed back towards the pile of rubble. We could hear screams off in the distance. The trolls had survived. Where they were, we didn't know. But the pile of rubble stretched for a long, long way, and we could watch every few hours as another section of that ridgeline began to crumble away, almost like Mount Suribachi back in World War II, just fell down. We could see in the side of the mountains that there were still other rooms, other tunnels there into the sides. We looked, and on occasion we would see a single person human or otherwise, waving for help. We didn't have people who could fly, but we did what we could. As we crossed the rocky area, it was nothing but rubble. You couldn't pass it with a vehicle. It was far too dangerous. And, of course, four-wheel drive could do a lot of things, but it can't traverse boulders like that. We finally got to the other side, and we could see something that we had thought had been gone. Real, honest-to-God cities and towns. We could see the skyline off in the distance. We didn't know what city, and honestly, I don't think any of us cared. We looked, and there was a small town off to our right, and farther off to the left, there was another small town just barely visible. We looked up, and we could see things flying around. We didn't know what they were. I assumed helicopters at that point. And we saw down in one of the villages a pile of not smoke but dust. Pulling out the binoculars I had retrieved, I looked over and realized that one of the trolls had gone through and was now ripping a couple of houses apart, probably looking for food. Those things flying around weren't helicopters. The dragons had woken up and were now going across the entire area. We had no idea how far they would get. We had no idea if we could even bring our people over to these towns. Would we be accepted? I doubt it. Because we may be human enough to accept others. We may be human enough to survive when we were supposed to die. We might be human enough to accept our new changes to whatever in the hell we were now. We may be human enough to fight off any type of danger that came that way. We may be human enough to even make peace with others that are of a completely different species to us. We are human enough to have compassion. We are human enough to care. We are human enough not to take advantage of others. And we are human enough to fight and risk everything for our own. Asking the technicians, where else was this done? They said in 2 other directions there were valleys just like this one. Valleys that were also full of creatures similar to us. This made all of us non-humans smile, as we knew there would be brethren out there of us, and we found out very quickly, within a year, that the only ones we could reproduce with were those of our own kind. There were exceptions, of course, but without refilling the populace, what were we going to do? That is when one of the technicians actually chuckled. Why would you need to do that? You can't die. What? We asked her why in the hell she would say that. She simply stated, well, is it economically feasible that something you just spent a few $1,000,000 creating can just be simply shot and you can't get any more out of it? Of course not. You didn't notice that all of you can regenerate a whole lot faster? When's the last time any of you had a cold? And we thought about it for a moment. This is true. Whatever they had done to us had enhanced a lot of our properties. This left me very flabbergasted. As I was looking off, I heard one of my compatriots simply say, "So, I guess that means we're more than human enough." And seemingly on cue, another section of the mountain fell, but not where we thought it would. Almost 30 degrees off from the center of the valley, another section simply began to crumble. It was like the entire thing was coming down as a house of cards, but there was no explosion underneath. Apparently, the explosion itself had reached and done other things to the facility. The facility must be reaching all over the place. I simply looked, smiled, and said, well, if we're more than human enough, maybe we're more than human enough to go see what the neighbors are like.